Johnny Depp just exposed the most private truth of his life, hidden inside a nameless London gallery on a cold, rainy morning. The exhibition shatters the myth of the untouchable rebel the world thought it knew. And the secret he finally reveals is the most unexpected scandal of all: his family. The doors opened into a room so white and quiet it felt almost unreal, as if sound itself chose not to enter. No posters. No Hollywood signatures. No trace of the chaotic world that has followed Johnny Depp for 4 decades. Only soft, diffused light spilling gently across blank walls, inviting visitors to step into a space that belonged to no studio, no franchise, and no rumor mill, only to him. And that was the first shock: the silence. A silence so intimate it pressed against the skin, forcing everyone to lower their voices without even realizing why. People walked in expecting eccentricity, expecting theatrical madness, expecting Depp. Instead, they found a calm so delicate it felt sacred. The air carried the faint scent of oil paint, almost warm, almost human. And the deeper visitors moved into the room, the more a strange realization settled in. This wasn't an exhibition meant to impress, it was a confession, one carefully hidden under layers of color. Johnny had chosen painting instead of cinema. Why? Because some truths cannot survive the noise of dialogue or the violence of a camera lens. Some truths must be whispered, not performed. And painting, with all its imperfections, offered him a language raw enough, fragile enough, private enough. A language that allowed him to speak without defending himself. Without being misquoted. Without being judged. The colors told the story first. Pastel blues that breathed like quiet mornings. Muted pinks that trembled with memory. Soft golds resting against shadows. They weren't dramatic or polished, they didn't scream for attention. They looked unfinished by design, brushstrokes left open, edges blurred, outlines dissolving into air. As if he wanted the viewer to feel that these people, these relationships, were still living inside him, impossible to complete, impossible to close. Every imperfect stroke was intentional. A refusal to sanitize emotion. A refusal to pretend he was ever whole. Standing in that room, visitors felt more like intruders than observers. Not because the art was unwelcoming, but because it was too honest, honest in a way Hollywood never allows. There was no armor here. No character to hide behind. Only a man trying to place years of love, regret, gratitude, and loss onto canvas before they slipped through the cracks of his memory. The shock wasn't in the paintings themselves. It was in the vulnerability they carried. Quiet, restrained, but trembling at the edges, like a voice breaking mid-sentence. And the question began to echo among the viewers. Why reveal this now? Why open this door after so many storms, so many accusations, so many headlines that tried to rewrite him? The room offered no answers. Only hints. Only colors. Only the sense that this exhibition wasn't designed for fame, reviews, or collectors. It wasn't a comeback strategy. It wasn't a public apology. It wasn't even nostalgia. It was a release. A letting go. A surrender of stories he had held too tightly for too long. And somewhere in that stillness, visitors started to feel something unexpected, a warmth, subtle but unmistakable. Not the warmth of celebrity. The warmth of family. The warmth of someone finally brave enough to peel back a layer he never meant to show the world. This wasn't Johnny Depp performing. This was Johnny Depp revealing. And the revelation had only just begun. But what exactly was he revealing, and to whom? The first portrait didn't shout. It didn't demand attention. It pulled it, quietly, insistently, like a memory resurfacing at the exact moment you thought you had buried it for good. And that was the shock, the gentleness. On a wall that could have held chaos, rebellion, or anger, Johnny Depp placed something far more dangerous: his tenderness. Lily Rose appeared in muted pinks, the kind of pink that looks like dawn rather than innocence. Her hair, rendered in loose, drifting lines, didn't sit still on the canvas, it floated, as if caught between childhood and adulthood, between past and present. Her face, calm but not cold, held an expression that seemed to know more than she ever said. A quiet strength, threaded with something softer, hesitation, maybe, grief, maybe, or simply the weight of being her father's anchor in a world determined to capsize him. Visitors stood in front of that painting longer than they expected. They didn't understand why at first. Then the details began to reveal themselves, subtle, nearly hidden, but impossible to ignore once noticed. On her lips, fine golden strokes shimmered faintly under the light, arranged almost like musical notes. A private reference, a father's nod to the daughter who lived between the worlds of cinema and melody, artistry and expectation. The shock wasn't that Johnny painted Lily Rose. Everyone knows she is the child who walked beside him through red carpets and storms. The shock was how he painted her, not as a celebrity, not as a muse, but as a question he still didn't know how to answer. Because behind the softness of the portrait lay something harder, an undercurrent of tension so quiet it could easily be mistaken for serenity. The tension of a father who watched the world judge his daughter for sins that were never hers. The tension of a daughter trying to build her own identity while the world insisted on defining her through him. The tension of two people bound not just by love, but by the wounds fame leaves behind long after headlines fade. The documentary tone of the room shifted when viewers reached this painting. Something slowed down. Conversations softened. It felt less like viewing art and more like listening in on an intimate confession neither father nor daughter ever planned to say aloud. Why pink? Why mist-like edges? Why the gold music notes only visible when the light hit just right? Because Lily Rose, in Johnny's world, is not clarity. She is atmosphere. She is transition. She is the space between who he was and who he's trying to become. Art critics whispered theories. Some said the muted palette symbolized the fragile years after Johnny's public trials, years in which Lily Rose distanced herself, then slowly returned, cautiously, like someone approaching a wounded animal. Others said the softness expressed the one version of himself Johnny still wished he could protect, the father, not the actor, not the scandal. But the truth felt simpler. And heavier. This wasn't a portrait of Lily Rose. This was a portrait of how Johnny sees her. A reminder that no matter how brutal the world becomes, there remains one person whose existence forces him to soften, to listen, to breathe. The painting carried a warmth that unsettled viewers, not because it was sweet, but because it felt like looking at an open wound healing in real time. You could almost imagine Johnny painting it in silence, each brushstroke an apology he didn't know how to articulate, each shade of pink a memory he wasn't ready to release. And beneath that softness, a question lingered, unspoken, unresolved. What does a father owe the child who held his heart while the world tried to break it? The portrait didn't answer. It only asked. It only invited viewers deeper. But the next painting, the one waiting on the adjacent wall, held a very different energy. What happens when tenderness gives way to wild, chaotic joy? If Lily Rose's portrait was a whisper, Jack's was an explosion, one so sudden, so bright, it felt almost reckless. Visitors described the shift as disorienting, like stepping from a cathedral into a street carnival. And maybe that contrast was the point. Johnny didn't just paint his son, he painted the collision of joy and fear that fatherhood had etched into him. Jack's portrait burned with saturated colors, reds that pulsed like heartbeat, blues that vibrated against the edges, strokes that overlapped without ever blending, as if refusing to be tamed. His grin, stretched wide across the canvas, radiated a confidence that bordered on defiance. It wasn't a quiet smile. It was the look of someone who had inherited his father's mischief but not yet his scars. At first glance, the portrait looked joyous. Untamed. Alive. But as with everything Johnny touches, the truth lived in the details. Beneath the layers of color, you could see faint outlines, ghost strokes he had painted over, then painted over again. Hesitations. Corrections. A father attempting to capture a son he knew was already slipping out of his grasp. Because Jack, unlike his sister, had chosen to live outside the spotlight. No interviews. No red carpets. No carefully curated image. And that distance, the quiet refusal to participate in Hollywood's machinery, left Johnny both relieved and terrified. What does a father do when the child he loves chooses a world he cannot follow? The documentary rhythm of the room changed again as viewers approached the canvas. The bold colors invited them in, but the dissonance between the surface joy and the underlying tension held them in place. The brushstrokes felt almost like movement, quick, impulsive, charged with the energy of someone painting too fast, afraid the moment might vanish before he could catch it. On Jack's shirt, barely visible among the chaos of color, was a tiny red heart. The shock wasn't the heart itself, it was its size. So small. So carefully hidden. As if Johnny feared that acknowledging love too openly might fracture the freedom his son fought to protect. It was the most fragile mark in the entire painting, and yet it carried the heaviest weight, the fear of losing what he loves by holding it too tightly. Critics speculated endlessly. Some said the wild palette represented Jack's youth, his unpredictability, his energy, his unscarred laughter. Others believed the chaotic layering reflected Johnny's own unsettled spirit, projecting itself onto the son who reminded him most of his younger self. But the most compelling interpretation came from a quiet viewer who simply whispered, "This looks like the version of Johnny he wishes he could have saved." Because Jack represents something Lily Rose does not. The boyhood Johnny lost too soon. The freedom he traded for fame. The innocence he didn't get to keep. And in painting Jack, he wasn't just honoring a son. He was mourning a self. The portrait felt less like a tribute and more like a plea, one that trembled beneath the vibrant surface. A plea for Jack to stay wild, stay joyful, stay untouched by the shadows that consumed so much of Johnny's life. But the most unsettling question of all emerged as viewers stepped back from the canvas. Was this painting a celebration of Jack's spirit, or a warning of the storm Johnny fears is waiting for him? That ambiguity lingered in the air, deepening the emotional weight of the room. And then, on the next wall, a portrait that no one expected, one that would change the entire narrative of the exhibition, waited like a ghost resurfacing. Why would Johnny paint the woman who shaped him and broke him in equal measure? It was the only painting that made the room fall completely silent. Not the stunned silence of surprise, nor the polite silence of respect, but the kind of silence that happens when a wound, long closed, is touched again without warning. Visitors slowed their steps as if their bodies sensed the shift before their minds did. Because on the far wall, bathed in soft blue light, was her. Vanessa Paradis. The woman Johnny Depp did not marry, yet built a life with. The woman he did not lose suddenly, but slowly, piece by piece, year by year. And there she was, rendered not with the intensity of a lover nor the nostalgia of a former flame, but with the quiet reverence of someone painting a chapter of his life he never learned to rewrite. Her portrait was serene, almost unbearably so. Soft blues hugged the contours of her figure, while golds brushed lightly across her skin like the last trace of sunlight on a winter afternoon. Her posture was relaxed, hands folded gently in her lap, her gaze turned slightly away, not avoiding, not rejecting, just remembering. Or perhaps choosing not to remember. It was the gentleness that shocked people first. This was not the kind of portrait a man paints of an ex. It was the kind of portrait a man paints when love has transformed but never disappeared. Then they noticed the bird. A tiny, delicate bird nestled in her hair, almost invisible unless the viewer leaned in. Painted with strokes so faint they looked like they might fade if touched. Why a bird? Why hide it? And what truth was he trying to protect, or confess, by placing it there? Some believed it symbolized freedom. Others thought it represented forgiveness. But for those who knew their history, the message felt sharper. Vanessa was the person who gave him wings when he didn't know how to stand. She became the quiet architecture of his stability, the sanctuary he referenced but rarely named. Because beneath the serenity of the portrait lay something far more fragile. A fracture line. A regret. A gratitude that came too late. The documentary pacing of the gallery shifted once more. Viewers weren't just observing, they were witnessing the aftermath of a story Hollywood never fully told. A story not of betrayal, but of erosion. Not of scandal, but of two people slipping away from each other while still holding on to the echoes of who they once were. Art critics later said the brushwork around Vanessa's eyes carried something unusual, an unspoken ache. Not sadness. Not longing. Something subtler. The weight of someone who had loved without asking for applause. Someone who had endured the cost of loving a man the world believed it owned. Johnny's choice of color made the message even clearer. Blue for calm. Gold for memory. Shadows for the years they survived. Light for the years they lost. But the bird, placed so delicately it was almost a secret, felt like the confession he never said aloud. Did she set him free? Did he break her without meaning to? Or was the bird meant to show that she remained, even now, woven into the architecture of his becoming? When someone finally asked him directly why he painted her, his voice was quiet, almost apologetic. They've always been my sanctuary. Even in chaos, I come back to them. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. The painting said everything. And yet the portrait stirred a deeper question, one visitors whispered among themselves as they stepped back, suddenly aware of the emotional intimacy they had just trespassed upon. Was this painting a farewell, or an attempt to reclaim something he fears he can never recover? The answer wasn't on the canvas. It waited elsewhere, hidden in the final reactions of the world watching him reveal his heart. But how would fans, critics, and the public interpret this unexpected tribute to a love that never fully ended? No one expected the crowd outside the gallery to swell the way it did. By mid-afternoon, the quiet London street transformed into a murmuring corridor of disbelief, fans wiping their eyes, critics scribbling notes with the urgency of people who sensed they were witnessing something their industry had failed to predict. Because the shock wasn't just inside the room. It was what the room revealed about him, and everyone thought they already understood. The first wave of reactions came from fans, those who had followed Johnny through roles, scandals, trials, victories, and collapses. They entered the exhibition expecting eccentricity. They left carrying something closer to grief. "It feels like walking inside his heart," one young woman whispered, clutching her phone against her chest as though the emotions might spill out if she loosened her grip. Another stood silently in front of Vanessa's portrait for nearly 10 minutes before murmuring, "No one paints their ex like that unless something still hurts." But the more surprising reactions came from art critics, people not easily moved by celebrity attempts at creativity. Many arrived prepared to dismiss the show as vanity, another actor dabbling in paint. Instead, they found themselves studying the canvases with unsettling respect. One critic, known for his ruthless commentary, stood in front of Lily Rose's portrait and whispered to a colleague, his layering technique. "I haven't seen this kind of emotional density since early Freud." Not a comparison made lightly, and certainly not one anyone expected for an actor long labeled, too eccentric for his own good. Yet the praise wasn't about technical mastery alone. It was about intention. Johnny had painted without polish, without perfection, without the safety net of Hollywood's machinery. The rawness of the work forced viewers to reckon with something uncomfortable, vulnerability from a man whose public image had been built on mystery and resistance. Social media ignited next. Clips from inside the gallery spread with alarming speed. The photos of Vanessa's portrait in particular sparked a frenzy of speculation. Was it a tribute? A confession? A message? Or something more fragile, an apology coated in blue and gold? Hashtags trended worldwide within hours. Artists weighed in, analyzing brushstrokes. Psychologists commented on the emotional transparency. Even those who had criticized Johnny in the past admitted, sometimes reluctantly, that the intimacy of the exhibition could not be dismissed as performance. But the most striking reactions came from people who had no opinion of Johnny at all. Ordinary viewers who walked into the gallery curious and walked out quiet, thoughtful, unsettled. "There's something about those paintings," one older man said as he stepped outside into the drizzle. "They're not about fame. They're about the people who keep us human, even when the world forgets that we are." And that, perhaps, was the true shock. The exhibition didn't rehabilitate Johnny Depp. It didn't glorify him. It didn't excuse him. It simply humanized him in a way that felt almost intrusive, like reading a private letter that was never meant to be found. Lines continued wrapping around the block for days. People waited in the cold not for spectacle, but for sincerity. For closeness to a story that was still unfolding, still trembling, still refusing to resolve itself neatly. And with every visitor who left the gallery, one question grew louder, heavier, impossible to ignore. If these paintings are Johnny's thank you, then what is he preparing to face next? Because no man reveals his heart this openly unless something deeper, something unspoken, is coming. As the final visitors drifted out of the gallery, the room fell back into the stillness Johnny had crafted with such precision, a silence thick with meaning, the kind that lingers long after footsteps fade. And in that quiet, something became unmistakably clear: this exhibition was not about art. It was about reckoning. For decades, the world had demanded versions of Johnny Depp, Captain Jack, the Mad Hatter, the misunderstood rebel, the fragile survivor, the controversial figure dragged across front pages like a headline refusing to die. But in this small, unassuming gallery, he dismantled all of them. Not dramatically. Not defiantly. Just, gently. With colors instead of words. With silence instead of explanations. And the message, subtle, literary, documentary in its restraint, unfolded slowly across the paintings. Family is the only truth that has never betrayed him. Not fame. Not love stories rewritten by tabloids. Not the industry that celebrated him one year and condemned him the next. The portraits of Lily Rose, Jack, and Vanessa formed a triptych of emotional geography, 3 coordinates mapping out the only place he has ever returned to willingly: home. But not home as an address. Home as a feeling. A refuge. A memory that holds steady even when every other foundation cracks. The documentary tone deepened as critics began connecting the dots. The softness in Lily Rose's portrait reflected the years he clung to his daughter's quiet loyalty when the world turned violent. The vibrant chaos of Jack's painting echoed the desperate hope of a father wanting his son to escape the shadows he could not outrun. And Vanessa, painted with the patience of someone repairing a memory with trembling hands, revealed the unresolved ache of a love that never fully released him. It was a confession, yes. But also a warning. A reminder that every public storm leaves private wreckage behind. And visitors began to ask the same haunting question. Was Johnny saying goodbye to a chapter, or preparing for a chapter the world isn't ready to hear? Because no artist reveals this level of vulnerability without purpose. No man opens his chest to the world unless something inside has shifted, broken, healed, or awakened. The literary tempo of the narration softened. The room, once filled with bold colors and emotional heat, now hummed with a quieter force: acceptance. Not the kind born from surrender, but the kind born from finally telling the truth you spent half your life avoiding. And the truth was this. In the end, Johnny Depp is not telling us about his family. He is telling us about himself, the man he was, the man he failed to be, and the man he is still trying to become. The paintings are not perfect. Neither is he. But both are honest. And sometimes honesty is the only redemption left to a man who has spent years being everything except understood. The final wall of the exhibition carried no portrait. No color. No signature. Just a single line printed in small, nearly invisible type. Sometimes art speaks when words fail. Visitors stood in front of it longer than they expected. Some took photos. Others simply stared. Because that line, quiet, almost shy, felt like the key to the entire exhibition. Johnny wasn't asking the world to forgive him. He wasn't asking them to admire him. He wasn't even asking them to understand him. He was asking for something far more fragile. To be seen as a father, not a myth. As a man shaped by family, not scandal. As someone whose loudest truth is spoken in silence. And so the question, the cliffhanger, remains suspended in the air for anyone who walks out of that gallery and back into the noise of the world. If this is the truth Johnny reveals in paint, what truths is he still keeping unspoken?